Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast.
I think one of the unintended consequences of the assault on climate science that began 2 decades ago was that it has led to this sort of new generation of battle-ready, outspoken scientists.
Hey adapters, welcome back to another exciting episode. I'm Doug Parsons, your host of America Adapts. Yes, that was the legendary climatologist Dr. Michael Mann. He's back on America Adapts. Mike just won the Tyler Prize along with Dr. Warren Washington. The Tyler Prize is the Nobel Prize equivalent in environmental achievement. It's a well-deserved honor. He's been a hero to so many of us for a long time. He's been fearless in the face of constant harassment from climate deniers. He's a modern-day climate Jedi. Mike and I discuss President Trump and his climate policies, how adaptation is becoming a bigger issue in the climate realm. We also talk about how a new generation of climate scientists are fighting it back against climate trolls, something Dr. Mann has endured for decades. Finally, we ended on an inspirational note, discussing the global youth climate movement. This is a great episode, folks. Always an honor to have Mike on. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge my previous episode. I hosted 8 other climate podcasters. It has had a fantastic reception. It was an honor to have all those folks on, learning what they do and sharing their work with my listeners. It was nice to connect with so many of them. Definitely check out that episode. Okay, some upcoming episodes. Next up is Dr. Kyle White from Michigan State, and we're going to be taking a deep dive into indigenous adaptation work and proper ways to engage tribal communities. Kyle is a tribal member himself, and it's a deep, rich, and sometimes raw conversation about tribal issues. I also have an upcoming episode on climate science fiction, where a professor at Yale does some research on how cli-fi is influencing people's behavior. Fascinating stuff. Also, Dr. Marcy Rockman, former adaptation coordinator for the National Park Service, is coming on to talk cultural resource adaptation. Okay, some upcoming travel. I'm headed to the National Adaptation Forum in Madison, Wisconsin. I am very excited to go to this one. It happens every 2 years. And I am going to meet some of you. It is a rare opportunity to meet my listeners in person, and there will be many of them there. I'm so excited. If you are planning to go, please reach out. Reach out in advance. Email me and let me know so I can be on the lookout for your name. Some of you have already reached out to let me know that you'll be there, and I want to meet you in person, and I want to hear about what you do, and we could talk about adaptation. And it's a whole conference of adapters. It's a perfect chance to chat. Okay, I'm also going to St. Augustine in May for the Keeping History Above Water Conference. It's about sea level rise and historic preservation. I'm being sponsored by the University of Florida to record a podcast and lead a podcasting workshop. That should be fun for those who want to learn how to launch your own podcast. I'll be leading them through that effort. Okay, I'll let you know how that goes. All right, just a reminder, America Adapts is a charitable organization that needs your support. Please consider giving. It's a tax-deductible donation. You can find links on these show notes. It's a We Didn't Donate page that make it very simple. You can donate monthly, you can donate weekly, you can donate once. Please consider giving. That's how we keep up all these great conversations. Also, if you're interested in partnering on a specific podcast, let me know. You've heard me collaborate with World Wildlife Fund, Harvard, UCLA, and University of Florida. There are so many stories to tell on this emerging issue of adaptation, so let's see if we can collaborate on a future episode. Also, if you are interested in having me speak at a public or corporate event, please email me. I've been doing some keynote presentations, and they are so much fun. I love talking to people. I have a lot of experience presenting, and the podcast and all my guests make for some great stories. And I share my own experiences in adaptation. I've been there for a long time, and I just share my insights of what's happening. And I will talk about adaptation in ways that will motivate and inspire you. You can contact me via the website, americaadapts.org. Okay, adapters, roll up your sleeves, and let's join in with Dr. Michael Mann. Hey, welcome back, adapters. On today's very special episode, I am excited to be hosting famed climatologist Dr. Michael Mann. Dr. Mann is the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science and the Director of the Earth System Science Center at Pennsylvania State University, and the scientist behind the famed hockey stick research. Hi, Mike. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be with you.
Okay, so just first off, a big congratulations on just winning the 2019 Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. Were you sort of expecting this? I mean, this is sort of the Nobel Prize equivalent in the environmental realm. Did you have any sort of sense?
I was deeply honored to receive the prize and to share it with a real hero of mine, Warren Washington, who is a climate scientist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, one of the first scientists actually to develop the sorts of theoretical models we now use to do experiments, to project future changes in climate. So it was really an honor it was also, by the way, I believe the second African-American recipient of a PhD in meteorology or atmospheric science in the country. So a great scientist, a great person, an inspiration. And so it was especially meaningful to be able to share the award with him this year. I'm just thankful to the committee for, recognizing my efforts, not just to try to advance the science of climate change, but to try to communicate it to the public and policymakers. And I was gratified, that they recognized both of those efforts.
Well, very well deserved. And just as a side note on Dr. Washington, I won't be speaking to him, but I'll have some links to his story. It really is amazing. He was doing some modeling work back in the 60s where they were using clunky computers and, just some groundbreaking work.
Yeah, he was running climate models when I was still crawling on the ground, learning how to walk. So, yeah.
That is amazing. Okay, there's a Tyler Prize reception. I think it's in May, and each of the winners is going to give a speech, and sometimes actually some news can be made during those speeches. Have you started working on yours yet?
No, it's on my long list of overdue tasks, but I'm looking forward to again, sort of sharing the stage with Warren and hopefully providing some insights into, why it is that we do what we do and why it is that this is not just an important scientific matter, which it is to both of us. I think both Warren Washington and I were drawn to this field because of the fascinating physics, the science that there is to do. But ultimately, both of us have come to appreciate the opportunity to also play a role in informing society about the implications of our science. And so I imagine that our comments will be along those lines, probably talking about our respective experiences, which are very different, our life history, our career paths. And life histories are very different, but we've sort of arrived at the same place. And so I guess, hopefully we'll be able to provide some insights.
Okay, so you probably don't remember this, but when we last chatted, it's been a couple of years now, President Trump, we're now saying President Trump, just got elected. And part of our conversation, we were sort of speculating on how bad he could be on climate change. And I think there were some slivers of hope. Maybe he won't be nearly as bad as we think. So were we wrong?
Yeah, I've tried to put that period of time out of my memory, so it's hard to really recall. No, it's a bit ironic because that fall before the election, before Trump was elected, I co-authored a book with Washington Post cartoonist Tom Tolles about climate change denial. It's the madhouse effect, how climate change denial is threatening our planet, ruining our politics and driving us crazy. And at the time, I remember colleagues sort of criticizing us. So, why are you writing this book about climate change denial when we're past all of that? The age of denialism is over. The next, 4 years are going to be all about solutions and moving forward and action. And of course, history had something else in mind. And we do now find ourselves very much back in the madhouse. Just today, Donald Trump was tweeting the words of an industry-funded climate change denier, which, essentially embraced the notion that climate change isn't happening, it's not having any impacts. Tell that to the people of Puerto Rico or California or, North Carolina, Houston, or around the world. Literally, as we speak, Australia is still sort of dealing with the devastation of record extreme weather down there, floods and unprecedented heat waves. Tell that to the people who don't have the luxury of debating whether or not climate change is real or a problem because they're dealing with the damaging impacts already. So, it's absurd that even today, literally today, the president continues to tout climate change denialism, even as the people that he's supposed to represent are dealing with the devastating impacts of the climate changes that we've already allowed to happen.
It really is just an odd presidency. You think of, I guess, especially on the environmental side, it's been the area I've been in. And sometimes it's like you always think of the worst case scenario. And most of the time, it's never quite as bad as like people make it out to be. But quite frankly, it's been worse than sort of like I think what you said in the previous podcast is that one of the most extreme things that he could do would be pull out of the Paris Agreement. And neither of us thought he'd really do it. And he did it.
Yeah, or has threatened to do so, and if he wins a second term, he would be in a position to make good on that threat. Hopefully, he won't get that opportunity. But even the threat of withdrawing from Paris has already taken a toll because it provides an excuse to other countries that really were mounting a considerable effort to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement. China was decommissioning coal-fired power plants. They were actually exceeding the commitments that they had made at Paris. But now that the other of the world's two largest emitters, the U.S. under Donald Trump, has now threatened to not meet its obligations under Paris, that has provided China an excuse for not doing their own due diligence. And we've seen just in the past 2 years, global carbon emission numbers, after having flatlined, and they looked like they were ready to make that downward curve that we need to see. Well, instead, they crept up again over the last 2 years. And that's in part because China has eased off on their own efforts to limit their carbon emissions, because with the other of the world's largest two emitters, the United States, indicating that it is no longer making a good faith effort to meet its obligations, that gives other countries like China an excuse not to meet theirs. And we're seeing the impact now in terms of numbers that are now ticking up again. And you can attribute that directly to Donald Trump and the fossil fuel interests that he essentially is serving as a surrogate for.
I wonder, in this age of Trump and just your own personal situation, you've been subject to a lot of harassment, climate trolls and all that. But I'm just curious, has the reverse kind of happened? Are you still harassed at the same level, or is it sort of lessened? Did his election kind of reduce some of that pressure? What's going on with you?
Oh, I think many of my critics have sort of moved on to more fertile pastures. What they try to do is they try to take you down when you're a young, vulnerable scientist. And I wrote about this in my book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. I even coined a term, the Serengeti strategy, based on experiences that I had at the Serengeti and watching, the way that lions will attack vulnerable members at the edge of a herd. And I sort of likened that to the way that the fossil fuel industry and those who advocate for them and those who serve as attack dogs on their behalf, they do the same thing. They look for vulnerable young scientists that they can make an example out of. And that's what they tried to do to me literally 2 decades ago. I withstood that assault. I stood firm. I stood up for my science. And in fact, it caused me to become far more outspoken because I recognized the importance of not ceding the ground to the climate change denialists and making sure that, that the public discourse is informed by the voice of science. And I've become a very passionate science communicator as a result of that. And so, they now have turned their attention to other scientists, younger scientists, that they can try to intimidate and to essentially intimidate and to cow them into sort of withdrawing from the sort of larger public sphere. I see part of my role today as being, as defending and helping some of these younger scientists who find themselves now in the same sort of situation that I was literally 2 decades ago.
Well, I think on that note, what you're seeing, on Twitter, on other social media, there are climate scientists that are really stepping up, and you're seeing a lot more of them. And they're, quite frankly, they seem quite confident to kind of respond to these things. And so I'm encouraged by that.
Absolutely. I think, ironically, and I've expressed this opinion before, I think one of the unintended consequences of the assault on climate science that began 2 decades ago was that it has led to this sort of new generation of battle-ready outspoken scientists who are attracted to this field, not just because there is interesting science to do, but because there's a role to serve as a facilitator in the public discourse, a communicator of that science. And I am really encouraged also by this younger generation of engaged scientists who see their role, again, not as being not just to do the science, but, as my good friend Susan Joy Hassel likes to say, science isn't done until it's communicated. And I think that's, a guiding principle for many of the scientists in our field today.
Okay, maybe you can clear this up for my listeners. And over the last 2 years, we've heard all sorts of assaults on science funding, or this particular climate research won't be funded, NOAA and some of the big federal agencies. Now, none of that is good. And I think just in the last couple of days, we've seen the president's budget where huge cuts to science funding. But how does that work? You're at a public university and you do your research, and I'm sure you probably get some federal money, but are there particular things that we really should be concerned about this all, but it just, when you read these things, you're like, oh, they're no longer going to do this research. And I like to think that there are some redundancies in the system. What's really kind of going on with some of the key climate research?
Yeah, well, the good news is that, believe it or not, Congress held firm in the last round when the president, in the last budget negotiations, when the president once again wanted and threatened to, in his budget, contained very large cuts to the major science organizations, the National Science Foundation, NOAA, and the Department of Energy, et cetera. There was really concerted pushback from the entire scientific community. And even today, even with the loss of so much of the good faith that we once had in our political discourse, we did see congressional Republicans actually rise to the occasion. There are enough relationships that have been cultivated between the science community and politicians on both sides of the aisle that in the end, Congress didn't support those substantial cuts. And we saw actually a small increase, not necessarily enough to keep up with inflation, but we did see a small increase in the budgets for the major science institutions. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the assault on science continues unabated from Trump and those in this administration. And it isn't enough for them to try to defund the science. They're also doing everything they can to attack the science, to attack scientists. Trump, infamously having just recently appointed a climate change denier to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and is establishing a council run by a climate change denier, fossil fuel industry funded climate change denier named Will Happer, the mission of which is to try to undermine the current scientific consensus in the world of policy when it comes to climate science. For example, the most recent report of the National Assessment, which is a scientific assessment process that is actually, that is literally reflects the position of the executive branch itself. And all of the science organizations contribute to this report that is congressionally mandated to come out every 4 years. It has the authority and the imprimatur of the administration itself. And so Trump's own administration published this report last fall. They tried to bury it, as you may recall, on Black Monday when they thought it wouldn't get attention. And the effort to try to bury the report, ironically, garnered huge amounts of media attention and got far more coverage for the National Assessment Report, which laid out in stark terms the reality and threat of climate change than it otherwise would have gotten. And so the latest thing is Trump is now trying to organize a committee that will undermine that previous report and indeed the current scientific consensus, at least within the framework of our executive branch when it comes to climate change. So the assaults haven't stopped. They continue unabated. And, the only way we will see that change is, of course, if people show up at the voting booth and vote for politicians who will represent us and our concerns and our interests rather than the sorts of fossil fuel interests who currently run the Trump administration.
So, Mike, maybe you could clear this up. And, I got a master's, and so I had a little bit more exposure of dealing with, professors and academics and this council that the president has put together. And I think it's like national security, and they're reassessing the climate information. And I think they're recruiting people like John Christie and people actually with some PhDs that have done a little bit of work, but they're kind of the usual suspects in the climate denial area. And I know this is a minefield issue, but how do these people still maintain, I guess, their space at these universities? Because the universities are producing good material, but I know tenure is an incredibly strong thing. But they're being hired to basically undermine the most important scientific issue of our age. Don't those universities, aren't they embarrassed by these people? I mean, how does that work?
Well, it's sort of funny, right? Because there is this attack on academia from the right. An attack on academic freedom, which is seen as a threat to many conservatives because it provides job security to academics who are outspoken. They don't have to worry about being fired because of their opinions or controversial views, and that's always been regarded as something that's absolutely critical. Academic freedom is sort of the cornerstone of the academic endeavor. It's what allows academics to speak openly and freely and to take sometimes controversial views. And so it's always ironic to me that this very principle that is under attack by conservatives, and our universities and their independence have been under assault under this administration in particular. And yet those same sort of protocols or principles are indeed exploited by the right, in this case by climate change deniers, because part of the reason that you can have fringe individuals who, not only are not doing good science, but arguably have not been honest and forthright, and where there are often legitimate questions that could be raised about intellectual integrity. And yet, most people are afraid to do that because of the principle of academic freedom. It would look potentially like an infringement on academic freedom. So, the irony is that this bedrock principle of academic freedom that is under assault by the right is actually what gives them cover when it comes to the continued support, institutional support, and influence that fringe members of the scientific community, climate change deniers, continue to have. And in many cases, these individuals are taking funding either directly or indirectly from fossil fuel interests to act as advocates for them, which arguably is a violation of the sort of the academic principles. You're not supposed, against conflicts of interest and undisclosed conflicts of interest in particular. It's deeply ironic, but there you have it. And that's why we continue to have fringe figures who are secure and often launder the imprimatur of their institution, be it Harvard or some of the other institutions whose name is sometimes dragged through the mud by fringe climate change deniers that continue to keep an affiliation with some of our most respected and celebrated institutions.
You got to wonder what happened to the scientists that they lost interest in having the respect of their peers. It's like that no longer matters to them because, I guess that happens. I have a couple more questions, Mike, and we didn't talk about this last time, and I certainly want to talk about it, is that my podcast mainly focuses on how society is going to adapt to climate change. And I'm curious, has that been coming up? You have your particular research, but as you're speaking to issues, there's just been a huge sea change in talking about adaptation, even in the last 2, 3, 4 years. How has that kind of come up for you?
Yeah, well, we have to adapt to those changes that are already upon us or that are baked in, that we will continue to see simply from the carbon that we've already burned and the warming influence that continues to have decades into the future. There is a certain amount of additional climate change that we will have to adapt to, no matter how strong our efforts are on the mitigation side. And my good friend John Holdren, who's the previous presidential science advisor under the Obama administration, is, I think, summarized the challenge very eloquently. Our response to climate change is going to be a combination of three things: mitigation, preventing as much climate change as we can; adaptation, adapting, building resiliency in response to those changes that have happened or are inevitable; and then the final category, suffering. And it's up to us to choose how much of each is acceptable, is tolerable. And I hope that we will absolutely minimize any additional climate change and any additional suffering by putting as much effort into mitigation as we possibly can while investing in adaptation, adaptive strategies, and infrastructure, especially for those, the least well off among us, because one of the truly unethical things about climate change is the differential impact that it has. The worst impacts are felt by the lowest strata of society, internationally and within individual countries like the U.S. Those who have the least affluence are least able to cope with the changes that are happening and are likely to change, and often live in the most unhealthy neighborhoods, near refineries and power plants. So there's a real ethical dilemma here as well, which is that those who arguably had the least to do with creating the problem, generated the least carbon emissions, are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And we do need to provide them with assistance, with resources to help them cope with the changes that are inevitable. And so, what does that mean? It means a more robust infrastructure. It means, obviously, building some resiliency with respect to coastal inundation and sea level rise, and more resilient structures that can better hold up in the face of increasingly extreme weather events. There is a need to invest quite a bit in adaptive infrastructure, while at the same time investing as much as we can in changing our energy infrastructure and shifting away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And the good news there is that that's an investment that returns on itself tenfold. For every dollar we spend preventing additional climate change, that's going to come back tenfold in terms of the damages it prevents. And at the same time, it creates the opportunity for new jobs. The clean energy industry provides far greater potential for new jobs than just continuing with the fossil fuel status quo. So, there's some good news here as well, which is that there's an opportunity to act on this problem and, increase economic opportunity across all sectors of society. But we need politicians who are willing to do what's right rather than what's most profitable to them and their funders. And that's where we all play a role. We have to get out and vote in every election, not just the presidential elections. And in the meantime, we have to exert as much pressure as we can on our policymakers by talking about the problem, talking about this with friends and family and classmates and work colleagues, and speaking out and writing about this and putting pressure on our local politicians as well as our national politicians. We need to use every lever arm there is available to push forward for dramatic and rapid change. And everybody plays a role in doing that. There isn't a single person who can't play an important role in doing that.
Awesome. Sort of final note, I have one last question for you, and I ask this of all my guests, is that if you could recommend one guest to come on America Adapts, who would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, if you could get Donald Trump, that would be very interesting.
I'll take him, yeah.
Hot seat and question him about all of the silly and foolish things he's said about climate change. I would love to see him actually have to answer for all of these absurd allegations and claims that he's made. But it probably wouldn't be very intellectually stimulating for your audience. It's such a good question. And I can just tell you there are a lot of people I'd love to hear from. I would love for you to talk to AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because she's sort of really at the the helm, with, of this new, Green New Deal, and which is really about climate change and clean energy and all the things that we're talking about that we need to do. John Holdren, our former presidential science advisor, who has so much wisdom that he's gained through his own experiences, and always has interesting insights to share. He would be a wonderful guest. And the list goes on. John Holdren, like me, is sort of at the older white male end of the spectrum. But, the voice of young folks like Greta Thunberg from Sweden, I believe it is, and Alexandria Villa, I forget how to say her last name, Alexandria V, I'll call her, who is sort of spearheading this effort in the States. So, these school kids who are striking to raise awareness about climate change and to demand action on the part of the adults of the world. They're not in a position to affect policy directly, and yet the policies we make, the policies we put in place today are going to have a profound impact on their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. And so they have, I would say, even more of a right to be participating and to be leading this discussion than we adults do. And it would be great for you to have one of those folks, Greta or Alexandria, on to talk about the problem as they see it from their perspective, as the generation that's going to bear the brunt of the decisions that the adults are making right now.
Great selections. And just for your own, I was invited to be the keynote at a recent Model UN conference, 600 high school students here in Arizona, where they had at University of Arizona, and they invited a climate person to come talk to them. And for the next 2 days, a lot of their sort of committee meetings that they do were going to be around sort of talking about climate change. So I was just truly inspired. And this is like that next generation of younger people that, you know what, you guys can do what you're doing with Paris Agreement, but in the long term, we're going to deal with this issue. So I was very encouraged by that whole scene.
Yeah, no, me too. I think that's a real game changer. And when people ask me, what is it that gives me hope and keeps me optimistic, it's the young folks, no question about it.
Thank you so much, Mike, for coming on. It is always such an honor. And again, congratulations on the Tyler Prize.
Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure, and happy to come back again sometime soon.
I will have you on anytime.
Yep, bye.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Dr. Michael Mann for coming back to the podcast. It's always a treat to have him on. And congrats again, Mike, for your well-deserved Tyler Award. I encourage my listeners to check out the show notes to learn more details of why Mike won, and also some information about his co-award winner, Dr. Warren Washington, one of the first African-American scientists working on climate models. As you heard from Mike, the hour is late, but he is still very optimistic we can deal with this climate challenge. I hope he inspired you to take it up a notch. All right, some final housekeeping. Don't forget to join the Facebook page and the Facebook community group. The group is private, but just search for America Adapts and ask to join, and I'll prove you right away. It's a chance to hear some insider info on the podcast and to see what other listeners are sharing on the wall. Some great conversations have come out of that. And on that note, I love hearing from you. I mean it. Just say hi. If you have an idea for a guest, which I hear all the time, let me know. Seriously, it's the highlight of my week, hearing from you, and sometimes it leads to really cool things. I mean, it leads to episodes, it leads to collaborations. I'm also doing this Letters from Adapters series, so please consider sending me your own note that I could share on air. I could read your story, please. And I'm at americaadapts@gmail.com. Okay, check out the website, americaadapts.org. Again, all this information is in my show notes. As I remind you every time, so is that contribution page. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.